Hey guys, it's Yusuf Justin Holcroft again here at Marshall Music, and thanks once again to Marshall for inviting me down here. We're going to talk today about something which is as important as your saxophone, and it's something we perhaps don't pay quite enough attention to. And it really is, when I say it's as important as your saxophone, I mean it. And it is this bit, the mouthpiece. Because your mouthpiece is the bit that fits in your body and is the bit that is responsible for creating the sound that your saxophone makes, therefore your voice. Now, in a previous video, we talked about embouchure. Embouchure is really crucial to get right at the beginning. Once you got your embouchure stable, if you're playing on a rubbish mouthpiece, you're going to be limiting the amount of expression you can get out of your saxophone. Now, a lot of you will have gone out and bought yourself your first saxophone, and it will be an entry-level model. These days, entry-level models, nothing wrong with them whatsoever. Brilliant saxophones on the market for relatively little money. The problem is, once you've laid out 13 or 15 grand for a saxophone, the last thing you want to do is spend more money on a mouthpiece when there is already a mouthpiece in the saxophone case. The problem is that the manufacturers of entry-level saxophones, in fact the manufacturers of pretty much any saxophones, are manufacturers of saxophones and are really good at it. What they're not really good at is making mouthpieces, and the mouthpiece tends to be the bit that they sort of spend the least amount of time and the least amount of money on. The result is that you'll get a mouthpiece with your saxophone which will work and will do the job and will get you started, but once you start trying to push it anywhere beyond the basic flat sound that comes out of a saxophone when you're starting off, once you start trying to push it beyond there, it will rebel. You can change reeds, you can change ligatures, you can change all kinds of things. You're going to be really limited in the amount of range you can get from the mouthpiece that you get with your entry-level saxophone. So the next thing you want to do, and it's worth saving up for, and when I say saving up, we're talking for a good mouthpiece from a specialist mouthpiece manufacturer. We're talking probably anywhere between 3 and however much money you can scrape together in a year. 3 grand, possible. 5 grand, 6 grand is probably where you're going to end up as a price point for a good mouthpiece. You can go up to certain brands of mouthpiece where they're charging you 12 to 15 grand. Okay, they are amazing mouthpieces. The question is always going to be, is there a 7 grand difference between a 5 grand mouthpiece and a 12 grand mouthpiece? That's going to be up to you. And it's a choice you'll have to make. But be aware, it's going to cost you a bit of money to get yourself a mouthpiece, but the benefits you will not believe. It will change your playing. Now, some of you already experienced this, and I see YouTube videos from local players where they've obviously gone out and got themselves a fairly serious mouthpiece, and you can tell the difference. Those players who are still playing on the mouthpiece that came with their saxophone, you can tell them as well. You can see and you can hear exactly that is a really basic mouthpiece that isn't giving them the range of expression that they want. Now, how often do you need to buy a mouthpiece? I bought this in 1983, and I haven't even touched another mouthpiece for my tenor sax since. My soprano sax mouthpiece I bought at the same time as the soprano sax, which was in 2001. And I haven't touched a different mouthpiece since. My alto mouthpiece I bought when I bought the alto, and I only started playing alto relatively recently, and I haven't looked at another alto mouthpiece since. So once you've got the mouthpiece that works for you, you don't need to change it. There are people who say, oh no, I need a different mouthpiece for this gig, and I need it. If it's the right mouthpiece to start off with, if you've chosen the right mouthpiece to start off with, guess what? You should never need to change. It should give you your sound, an individual sound, and it should be versatile enough for you to be able to play in lots of different scenarios. Right, so $1,000,000 question. How do we go about choosing a mouthpiece? Right, here's a question I'm going to throw straight back at you. Who do you want the sound like? Now, I've taught a lot of beginner saxophonists, or saxophonists in the early stage of learning the saxophone. And the first question, and those of you who've come across me before, the first question I will always ask is, who do you want to sound like? And I get this blank look and a questioning face, and what do you mean? If you haven't worked out who you want to sound like, then you have very little chance of sounding like them. That sounds really trite, and I don't mean it to sound facetious. What I mean is, if you haven't got a target to work towards, then you don't know whether you've got there or not. So here's the point. Don't be shy of imitating somebody. Don't be shy of saying out loud, I want to sound like him, or I want to sound like her. There's nothing wrong with that. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Charlie Parker, when he started off on the saxophone, had a really rubbish saxophone and a really rubbish mouthpiece, and had no access whatsoever to any kind of musical tuition. So he didn't know the first thing about music and had to teach himself. And the way he taught himself was to buy all of the vinyls, in those days shellacs, he could, of a saxophonist he liked called Lester Young. Problem was, Charlie Parker played alto and Lester Young was a tenor player. So what Charlie Parker did was whap up the speed of the vinyls so that the tenor of Lester Young sounded like an alto. Charlie Parker then tried to get exactly the same sound and copied the solos note for note. It's not a bad way of doing it. There are more modern players who will tell you that the best thing you can do to start learning is copy solos note for note, and not just the notes, but the sound. So at UCT, there used to be a time when, if you were in the UCT big band studying jazz, that the only time you were allowed to improvise a solo in a big band chart is when you could demonstrate that you could play the original solo perfectly. Which meant that if you were playing a Glenn Miller chart, you had to be able to sound exactly like Tex Beneke and play exactly the same notes as Tex Beneke in exactly the same style. Now, that's a really, really big ask. Or if you were playing Four Brothers by the Woody Herman Band, you had to be able to sound like either Stan Getz or Zoot Sims. And that's huge. So you had to be able to play the original solo perfectly before you were allowed to improvise your own solo. Now, that's a huge amount of discipline to be able to do that. There is no shame whatsoever, and a lot of great players have done it, in emulating somebody who's come before you and saying to yourself, I want to sound exactly like that. I did the same. And I've just hit the microphone, so that's probably gone pop! I did exactly the same. My first idol as a tenor saxophonist was a fairly obscure player called Paul Gonsalves, who was a modern, in those days, in the 1940s, a modern version of Ben Webster. So the same kind of Ben Webster sound, a bit edgier and very silky smooth sound, but quite funky. And he played with the Ellington Band from 1949 until he died in 1974, and was a run-of-the-mill big band sax player, but he was my first idol. So my first goal was to try and sound like him. So I started copying his solos. I then moved on to other players. My idol for the last few years, or my idols for the last few years, have been Dexter Gordon, Ronnie Scott, Tubby Hayes, British players who you probably never heard of, but are absolutely phenomenal. And those are the kind of players that I idolise, and I'm not afraid to say I will try and emulate them. And if somebody turns around to me and says, you sound like Ronnie Scott, then I'm not going to be ashamed. I'm going to be really proud of that. So, first question, who do you want to sound like? Next question is, once you've decided who you want to sound like, how do you go about getting that sound? Now, you know all of the sax players. So you can go through the alto players, you can go Hodges, Benny Carter, Charlie Parker, Sonny Stitt, Cannonball Adderley, David Sanborn, Grover Washington, Ornette Coleman. Tenor players, Coleman Hawkins, Lester Young, Dexter Gordon, Sonny Rollins, John Coltrane, Mike Brecker, Bob Berg, and so on and so on and so on and so on. Lots and lots of really great sax players that you could choose. Choose one and say to yourself, I want to sound like that, because that is your target for when you go and try and find a mouthpiece that suits you. Now, there's nothing wrong with trying to sound like somebody else. That's the big point here. And the mouthpiece is as important in creating your sound as the saxophone itself. You can have a Yanagisawa or a Selma or a Yamaha Custom, and have a rubbish mouthpiece on it and it will sound rubbish. You can have an entry-level saxophone with a good mouthpiece that suits you perfectly and you will sound absolutely stunning. So the mouthpiece is as important as the sax. Right, we're going to pause it there and I'm going to come back in the next video and start talking to you about what kind of different mouthpieces we can look at and how to go about choosing them.